she dreamed of being famous, but a cat completely changed her plans. It was exactly on the night she decided to give up that Maribel Ansley heard the softest meow in the world, a whisper so thin it seemed to ask permission from the city itself. Behind the corner cafe in East Nashville, between the smell of burnt coffee and the sharp January cold, she found the cat huddled beside the dumpster, disheveled smoke-colored fur, a thin scar crossing his snout, and green eyes that held the streetlight like someone guarding a secret. She picked him up without thinking. "You're just a Whisper," she said, and the name stuck there, pressed against her chest. Whisper. That early morning, the radiator in her apartment crackled like old wood. The kettle whistled. The building notice taped to the door reminded her that pets weren't allowed. Maribel, 32 years old, a bar singer counting coins on the kitchen counter, added up her failures. The producer who never called back, the empty audition, the overdue rent. The conflict that had consumed her for years had two sides: the pride of someone who swore she'd be famous, and the loneliness of someone who no longer had anyone to share the silence with. Whisper circled the living room, sniffed boxes, climbed a small stool and lay down, deliberately, on a forgotten file folder filled with old song lyrics. It wasn't an accident. Maribel opened the folder, as if opening a wound, and read verses she had locked away when fear began to rule her. The apartment felt hollow, despite Whisper's presence. A one-bedroom space on the third floor of a converted Victorian house that had seen better decades. The hardwood floors creaked with stories of previous tenants, and the single window faced an alley where morning light struggled to reach. She had moved here 3 years ago with dreams bigger than her bank account, drawn by Nashville's promise and the rent she could barely afford on a waitress's salary supplemented by weekend gigs. Whisper explored every corner with methodical curiosity, his paws silent on the worn carpet. He paused at the corner where her guitar case leaned against the wall, then moved to investigate the small stack of music magazines she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Each cover featured artists who had made it, their faces glowing with the success she had once believed would be hers. The building around them breathed with late-night sounds, Mrs. Chen upstairs practicing piano scales, the couple next door arguing in muffled voices, the old pipes groaning through the walls. Nashville never truly slept, but it dozed fitfully, dreaming of songs unwritten and chances missed. As she watched Whisper settle on her abandoned lyrics, Maribel felt something shift in the stale air of defeat that had filled the apartment for months. The cat's presence created a small pocket of warmth in the cold reality of her situation. His breathing was steady, rhythmic, like a metronome keeping time for a song she had forgotten how to sing. The next day, reality bit hard. The cafe manager where she played Saturday nights cut her pay in half. Halver, the building manager, stopped by to remind her of the no pets rule. The pale winter sun warmed nothing. Still, Whisper seemed immune to the world's urgency. 3 things about him caught her attention: an unshakable calm, as if every room had a secret center where he could rest, a methodical curiosity that led him to always choose the right object to touch, and a silent loyalty, presence without demands, a gaze without reproach. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. That evening, when Maribel tuned her guitar, Whisper lay down on the sheets containing an old, unfinished song. She picked up the verses again, and for the first time in months, felt her voice return whole. The weight of her decision to give up had been building for weeks. 3 years in Nashville with nothing to show but rejection letters, missed opportunities, and a growing pile of bills. She had come here from a small town in Ohio, carrying her mother's guitar and her father's stubborn belief that talent would be enough. The guitar was a 1987 Martin that her mother had bought second-hand and played at church services, its body worn smooth by years of faithful hands. Her parents had supported her move initially, proud that their daughter was chasing something bigger than their town could offer. But the monthly phone calls had grown more strained as her reports grew more discouraging. Her mother's questions about backup plans and her father's suggestions about coming home for Christmas carried the weight of loving concern mixed with growing worry. Whisper seemed to understand the geography of her disappointment. He avoided the corner where rejection letters were stacked, gave wide berth to the laptop where her nearly empty bank account stared back at her, but gravitated toward anything connected to music. When she played, He positioned himself where he could see both her face and her fingers on the strings, as if studying the relationship between feeling and sound. The building itself was a character in her story, a grand dame of a house that had been carved into 6 apartments sometime in the 70s. The other tenants were a mix of young professionals, aging hippies and fellow dreamers who had washed up in Nashville's wake. Halver, the manager, was a man in his 50s who wore the perpetual expression of someone dealing with problems he hadn't created and couldn't solve. That first week with Whisper, Maribel found herself humming while she washed dishes, something she hadn't done in months. The cat would sit on the windowsill, watching the world outside with the patience of someone who understood that interesting things happened to those who waited. His green eyes reflected the changing light throughout the day, bright emerald in the morning sun, deep forest in the afternoon shadows, and almost luminous when the streetlights came on. The building's no pets policy had been instituted after a previous tenant's pit bull had terrorized the mailman and left teeth marks in Mrs. Chen's door. But Whisper was different. He moved through spaces like he was apologizing for taking up room. His presence felt more than heard. As the chapter closed, Maribel sat cross-legged on her bed, Whisper curled beside her, both of them listening to the building settle into its nighttime rhythms. For the first time since arriving in Nashville, she felt like she wasn't completely alone. But morning would bring Halver's return, and with it, a choice that would determine whether this small spark of hope would be allowed to grow or would be snuffed out by the practical realities of rent, rules, and the relentless march of a city that had no patience for dreamers who couldn't pay their way. The third-floor neighbor, Clarine Murphy, a septuagenarian in floral dresses with short, measured steps, appeared at Maribel's door carrying a tray of cornbread. "I heard you singing. Is that cat yours?" He wasn't, not yet, but Whisper leaned his head into Clarine's palm as if answering, "I belong to whoever listens." Within days, routine reorganized itself. Mornings at a temporary job in a thrift store, afternoons rehearsing, evenings of coffee and music. The first sign of relief came at an open mic. Maribel sang the song recovered from the file, and 2 couples stayed until the end just to say the lyrics reminded them of something they had lost. Brief relief. That same evening, the bar owner mentioned a visionary producer in town. Dax Merrow appeared in fitted suits with large promises. The contract, many pages, little breathing room, offered exposure and demanded everything she was. Whisper, who never scratched anything, placed a claw on the paper's edge right beneath a clause that transferred authorship irrevocably. Maribel swallowed hard. She returned the contract unsigned. She went home trembling, half from fear, half from relief. Clarine's cornbread had been an act of reconnaissance disguised as Southern hospitality. The woman had lived in the building for 15 years and had developed an ear for the emotional weather of her neighbors. She could distinguish between the guitar playing of someone practicing and someone healing, between the footsteps of someone going somewhere and someone going nowhere. "That cat's got good instincts," Clarine said, settling into Maribel's only comfortable chair while Whisper investigated her canvas shoes with their sensible laces. Had a cat once who could spot trouble before it walked through the door. Of course, Trouble usually wore a suit and carried a briefcase just like that producer fellow you mentioned. The thrift store job had come through Clarine's network, a friend of a friend who needed someone with gentle hands and a good eye for mending. The bargain boutique occupied a converted gas station on Charlotte Avenue, its concrete floors painted cheerful yellow and its racks organized by color rather than size. The owner, Miss Dolores, was a woman in her 60s who believed that everyone deserved to look good, regardless of their budget. Maribel found unexpected comfort in sorting through donated clothes, imagining the stories behind each piece. A vintage blazer with a small ink stain might have belonged to a teacher. A cocktail dress with careful alterations could have seen dozens of celebrations. Whisper seemed to understand her need for gentle work. On her days off, he would wait by the door when her usual return time approached, as if his internal clock had synchronized with her schedule. The open mic at the Bluebird Cafe was a Nashville institution, a place where careers were born and dreams came to die with equal frequency. Maribel had performed there twice before with disastrous results. Once she had forgotten the words to her own song, and another time her guitar string had snapped mid-performance. But something was different this time. Maybe it was Whisper's presence, waiting at home like an anchor, or maybe it was simply having someone to return to. The song she chose was one she had written during her first month in Nashville, when hope still outweighed experience. She had found it in the folder Whisper had chosen to sleep on, its edges yellowed and its margins filled with crossed-out alternatives. The lyrics spoke of small towns and big dreams, of leaving and staying, of the space between what we want and what we need. "There's a highway that runs through my hometown," she sang, her voice finding its footing on the familiar melody. "But all the signs point away from here. There's a highway that runs through my heart now, but I'm not sure which direction leads me clear." The couple who stayed to talk to her afterwards, Jim and Sarah, married 37 years, said the song reminded them of their own move from Kentucky to Nashville in 1985. "We came here with nothing but a beat-up Corolla and a dream of making it in country music," Sarah said. "Didn't make it in the way we planned, but we made it in ways we never expected. But success, even small success, had a way of attracting the wrong kind of attention." Dax Merrow had been watching from the back of the room, his expensive suit and predatory smile marking him as someone who collected dreams for profit. He approached her table with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. "You've got something special," he said, sliding into the seat across from her without invitation. "But special doesn't mean anything in this town without the right connections. I can give you those connections." The contract appeared like a magic trick. Thick paper, dense legal language, and promises that glittered like fool's gold. Exclusive management rights, publishing deals, a percentage that grew larger with each clause. At the bottom, in letters smaller than prayers, the phrase that gave him ownership of anything she created during the contract period. That night, back in her apartment, Maribel spread the contract across her kitchen table, while Whisper investigated its corners. The cat had never shown interest in paperwork before, but something about this document drew his attention. When he placed his paw on that particular clause, his claw extended just enough to make a tiny tear in the paper, not enough to damage it, but enough to make a point. "You see it too, don't you?" she whispered, and Whisper's green eyes met hers with an expression that seemed almost human in its concern. The weeks that followed were exercises in small, daily sacrifices. Halver knocked again. "No pets, miss." Maribel breathed deeply, chose honesty, and asked for time. She offered to sing at the building's holiday party, help with the cleaning crew, pay an extra fee, anything that would fit in the thin envelope of her finances. It was Clarine who organized the petition on Whisper's behalf. Silent cats who heal neighbors deserve exceptions. The yes didn't come easy, but it came with conditions: microchip, vaccination, no roaming in common areas. It cost money she didn't have. Result: 2 extra weekends at the thrift store, an additional shift packing donated clothes, guitar propped against the wall until 3 in the morning. At Dr. Lenora Quinn's veterinary office, the stethoscope announced another bill. Whisper had a mild respiratory inflammation, treatable with care and medication. Maribel bought the antibiotic, postponed the rent. The real world doesn't forgive, but sometimes it listens. The veterinary office smelled of antiseptic and hope, its walls covered with photos of grateful pet owners and their recovered animals. Dr. Quinn was a woman in her 40s who had the gentle efficiency of someone who dealt with love and loss in equal measure. She examined Whisper with practiced hands, while he submitted to her attention with the patience he showed for most things. "He's been living rough for a while," she said, noting the scar on his nose and the slight malnutrition that proper feeding was already beginning to address. "But he's got good bones and a strong spirit. The respiratory infection is common in strays. Too many cold nights, too much stress on the immune system. With proper care, he'll be fine." The antibiotics came in small bottles with labels that seemed to mock her financial situation. $27 for a week's worth of medicine, money that could have bought groceries or put a dent in the electric bill. But looking at Whisper's trusting face, there was never really a choice. The petition that Clarine circulated through the building became a small masterpiece of persuasion. Rather than simply asking for an exception to the pet policy, it reframed Whisper's presence as a benefit to the community. Mrs. Chen upstairs mentioned how his soft purring through the thin walls helped her sleep better. The young couple next door noted that his presence seemed to calm their anxious rescue dog. Even Halver admitted grudgingly that there had been fewer noise complaints since the cat's arrival. But the bureaucracy of keeping a pet legally required more than goodwill. The microchip procedure, the updated vaccinations, the city registration, each step carried a price tag that seemed designed to keep pets in the homes of people who could afford them without question. Maribel found herself working extra shifts at the thrift store, her fingers growing rough from sorting through donated items, her back aching from lifting boxes of books and clothes. The guitar, her mother's Martin, began to feel foreign in her hands from the extended absences. Some nights she would come home too tired to play, too worried about money to find comfort in music. But Whisper would position himself on the couch where he could see both her and the guitar case, his presence a gentle reminder that some things were worth the sacrifice. As the chapter closed, spring was beginning to show itself in Nashville. Small green buds on the trees, longer days, the promise of warmth after a hard winter. Maribel sat on her fire escape, Whisper beside her, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and rose. The contract from Dax Merrow remained unsigned on her kitchen table, and her bank account remained stubbornly low, but something had shifted in the weeks since Whisper's arrival. For the first time since coming to Nashville, she felt like she was building something rather than just surviving, even if she wasn't entirely sure what that something might be. Spring opened the magnolias on the street, and the sweet smell entered through the building's windows. Whisper got his microchip and collar. Maribel and Clarine began walking around the block, as if dragging an invisible thread that stitched neighbors together. Children asking to hold the cat's leash, a baseball veteran suggesting a small stage in the square, Ivy, the school librarian, offering borrowed speakers. Small victories grew like stubborn weeds through cracks in the cement. And then, suddenly, the disappearance. On a windy afternoon, Whisper escaped through the crack when a delivery man left the door open. The apartment became too large within minutes. Maribel posted flyers on poles, searched alleys, called his name until her voice scratched. It was Clarine who found her sitting on the asphalt, hands empty, the world narrow as the neck of a bottle. The neighbor set cornbread in her lap. When what we love disappears, we sing louder. That's how he finds his way home. The magnolia trees along Fifth Avenue had always marked the seasons for Maribel, but this spring they seemed to bloom with unusual intensity, their white and pink petals carpeting the sidewalks like wedding confetti. The sweet, lemony fragrance drifted through her open windows, mixing with the coffee from the shop downstairs and the exhaust from the buses that carried dreamers and workers through the heart of Nashville. Whisper's microchip appointment had been scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Dr. Quinn's office. The procedure was quick, a small injection between his shoulder blades that would identify him forever as belonging somewhere, to someone. Maribel watched as the tiny device disappeared beneath his smoke-colored fur, thinking about how such a small thing could mean the difference between being lost and being found. The collar was red leather with a small silver tag engraved with his name and her phone number. Whisper wore it with dignity, never scratching at it or trying to remove it, as if he understood its significance. The weight of it seemed to give him a new sense of purpose as he moved through the apartment. No longer a temporary visitor, but a permanent resident. Their walks around the neighborhood became small events that gathered momentum like a snowball rolling downhill. Clarine, with her measured steps and floral dresses, provided respectability and local knowledge. She knew which dogs were friendly, which sidewalks were uneven, and which neighbors might be receptive to a gentle hello from a well-behaved cat. Mrs. Patterson, whose granddaughter visited on weekends, was the first to ask if Emma could pet Whisper. The little girl, maybe 6 years old, approached with the careful reverence children show to animals, her small hand extended for Whisper to sniff before gently stroking his head. "He's soft as clouds," she declared, and Whisper accepted the compliment by purring loud enough for everyone to hear. The baseball veteran was Tommy Rodriguez, a man in his 70s who spent most afternoons on his front porch reading newspapers and watching the world go by. He had played minor league ball in the 60s and 70s, good enough to dream but not quite good enough to make it to the majors. When he saw Maribel carrying her guitar case, he struck up a conversation about music and dreams and the fine line between persistence and delusion. "Used to be a bandstand in Centennial Park," he told her, gesturing toward the distance with a hand that showed the wear of too many catches and throws. Nothing fancy, but it gave folks a place to play for people who wanted to listen. City took it down in the 90s, said it attracted the wrong element. But maybe it's time for something like that again, you know? Community-sized, neighborhood-friendly. Ivy Chen, the school librarian, lived in a converted garage apartment behind one of the larger houses on the block. She was a woman in her 30s, with short black hair and the kind of energy that came from spending her days helping children discover worlds beyond their immediate experience. When she learned about Maribel's music, she mentioned the small sound system the school used for outdoor events. "We could probably work something out," she said, scratching behind Whisper's ears while he supervised from Clarine's arms. "The principal's always looking for ways to bring the community and the school closer together. Maybe some kind of outdoor concert series. Nothing big, just local folks sharing what they do." These conversations happened over the course of weeks, small seeds planted in casual encounters that began to grow into something larger. Maribel found herself thinking about music differently, not as a ladder to climb toward fame, but as a bridge to build between herself and her neighbors. Whisper seemed to catalyze these connections, his presence giving strangers a reason to stop and talk, his calm demeanor putting everyone at ease. But just as things began to feel settled, the universe reminded her that security was always temporary. It was a Wednesday afternoon in April, warm enough for open windows and the delivery man's impatience. Maribel had been at the thrift store, sorting through a donation of winter coats that someone had finally decided to part with now that spring had arrived. Miss Dolores had asked her to work an extra hour to process a large donation, and she had agreed, thinking of the few extra dollars it would mean for groceries. When she climbed the stairs to her apartment, the door was ajar. Not wide open, but enough for a curious cat to slip through and explore the wider world beyond. The delivery man was long gone, probably never realizing what he had done. The search began immediately and consumed everything. Maribel called Whisper's name until her throat felt raw, walked every alley within a 6-block radius, checked under porches and behind dumpsters. She posted flyers on telephone poles and bus stops, his photograph staring back at anyone who passed, smoke-colored fur, green eyes, and a red collar that should have made him easy to spot. Clarine organized the neighbors into search parties. Tommy Rodriguez walked his usual routes with extra attention to the spaces where a nervous cat might hide. Ivy posted Whisper's photograph on the school's social media pages. Mrs. Patterson promised her granddaughter that everyone would help look for the cloud cat. The first day passed without any sign of him. Maribel barely slept, startling awake at every small sound, hoping it might be Whisper at the door or window. The second day brought false hope. 2 different phone calls from people who thought they had seen him, but both sightings turned out to be other gray cats with other lives and other homes. By the end of the second day, Maribel sat on the sidewalk outside her building, her back against the brick wall and her hands empty of purpose. The flyers she had posted that morning seemed to mock her with their bright paper and desperate black letters. The city moved around her, cars and buses and people with places to go and people to meet, while she existed in a bubble of loss that made everything else seem distant and unreal. Clarine found her there as the streetlights began to flicker on, carrying a plate wrapped in a dish towel. "Cornbread," she said simply, settling beside Maribel on the concrete. "My grandmother's recipe. She used to say that when what we love disappears, we sing louder. That's how it finds its way home." "I don't feel like singing," Maribel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know, honey, but maybe that's when we need to sing the most." They sat together in the gathering dusk, 2 women bonded by concern for a cat who had somehow become central to both their lives. The cornbread was still warm, sweet with honey and rich with butter, comfort food in its purest form. Around them, the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythms, porch lights coming on, the sound of television shows and dinner conversations drifting through open windows, the distant hum of traffic from the larger streets. "He'll come back," Clarine said with the certainty of someone who had lived long enough to see cycles of loss and return. Cats like that, they know where they belong. Sometimes they just need to remind themselves that the world is bigger than one apartment, bigger than one block, but they come back to where the love is. Maribel wanted to believe her, but faith felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. The apartment upstairs would be empty and too quiet, filled with Whisper's absence in every corner where his presence had become familiar. The red collar and the microchip that had seemed like such important symbols of belonging now felt like cruel jokes. What good were they if he was lost beyond their reach? As the night deepened and the street grew quieter, Maribel climbed the stairs to her apartment with legs that felt like lead. The space that had felt too small when she first brought Whisper home now felt cavernous, every shadow a place where he might have been, but wasn't. She left the window open despite the cooling air, hoping that familiar scents might guide him back if he was somewhere close enough to catch them. The guitar case leaned against the wall like an accusation. She hadn't played since the search began, couldn't imagine finding music when everything felt broken. But Clarine's words echoed in the quiet. When what we love disappears, we sing louder. Maybe, Maribel thought as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep. Singing wasn't about feeling like it, but about needing to believe that someone, somewhere, was listening. At dawn on the third day, a noise on the windowsill. Whisper returned covered in pollen, carrying attached to his collar a crumpled flyer for the Spring Neighborhood Fair, Community Stage, Saturday. Coincidence? Maybe. But it was the kind of coincidence that determined people plant without realizing. Ivy had mentioned the fair weeks before. The veteran had talked about the stage. Clarine wanted to raffle treats for the daycare. Maribel had noted dates, and Whisper, methodical curiosity in cat form, always inserted himself where decisions were sprouting. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. She breathed in the smell of wet grass, washed the pollen from his snout, and decided, if she wouldn't be famous the way she had dreamed, she would be necessary in the way she was discovering. The costs came. To play at the fair, she would need an amplifier. She rented one in 3 installments, accepting an extra shift at the thrift store. She rewrote the lyrics with cold hands, wiping tears that stained the ink. Whisper lay on each finished page like someone stamping a passport. The night before, the stage in the square creaked as it was assembled. The folding chairs clinked like coins. The air smelled of cotton candy and grilled sausage. And then, the slap. Dax Merrow appeared with the smile of someone who guards doors. There's still time to sign. I have a bigger show tonight. Just need you to be there. Maribel felt wounded pride stretch the invitation from within. It was the same old shortcut. Whisper jumped onto the empty stage and curled around the microphone stand. The silence that followed was the kind of answer that doesn't fit in words. The sound at the window was so soft that Maribel almost missed it, a gentle scratching that could have been a tree branch or a loose shutter. But something in her chest recognized it before her mind fully woke, and she was at the window before she was completely conscious, pushing aside the curtains to find Whisper, balanced on the narrow sill outside. He looked like he had been on an adventure. His smoke-colored fur was dusty and decorated with yellow pollen that caught the morning light like tiny stars. The red collar was still securely around his neck, but attached to it, caught somehow in the buckle, was a piece of paper that fluttered in the slight breeze. "Where have you been?" she whispered, as she lifted him through the window, holding him close enough to feel his heartbeat against her chest. He purred in response, loud and continuous, as if he had been saving up his contentment for this moment. The paper attached to his collar was a flyer, creased and slightly torn but still readable. Spring Neighborhood Fair, Community Stage, Saturday, May 15th. Local performers welcome. Contact Ivy Chen for details. The date was this coming Saturday, just 4 days away. Maribel smoothed the flyer on her kitchen table, while Whisper explored his food bowl with the enthusiasm of someone who had been eating whatever he could find for 3 days. Had he somehow found this flyer, or had it found him? She remembered Ivy mentioning something about a spring fair weeks ago, but the conversation had been casual, the kind of information that gets filed away and forgotten until it becomes relevant. As she filled Whisper's water bowl and opened a can of his favorite food, Maribel realized that his disappearance had clarified something important. The 3 days without him had been filled with more human connection than she had experienced in months. Neighbors she barely knew had joined the search, sharing phone numbers and checking in with updates. Clarine had brought food and comfort. Tommy had walked extra miles looking under porches and behind garages. Even Halver had seemed genuinely concerned, asking about Whisper when he saw her in the hallway. The community stage at the spring fair wasn't Carnegie Hall or the Grand Ole Opry, but it was something real, a place where local people gathered to share what they did, where applause came from recognition rather than expectation. Maybe this was what she had been missing in her pursuit of fame, the difference between performing for an audience and singing for a community. But performing required equipment, and equipment cost money she didn't have. The rental company on Music Row had amplifiers available for weekend rentals, but even the smallest system cost more than she could manage in one payment. The manager, a patient man who had probably seen countless broke musicians, agreed to let her pay in 3 installments if she could provide a deposit and references. Mr. Loris at the thrift store agreed to be a reference and offered Maribel extra hours to help cover the cost. The work was harder than usual. A large estate donation had come in, boxes and boxes of clothes, books and household items that needed to be sorted, priced and displayed. Her hands grew rough from handling wire hangers and cardboard, and her back ached from lifting and organizing. But each extra hour meant a few more dollars toward the amplifier rental. The songs she chose for the fair were the ones that had found their way back to her since Whisper's arrival. Lyrics recovered from the folder he had slept on, melodies that had returned during late-night guitar sessions with him purring nearby. She rewrote them with careful attention, her cold fingers cramping around the pen as she worked at the kitchen table in the early morning hours before leaving for the thrift store. Some of the songs were about leaving home, others about finding it in unexpected places. One was about the way hope could survive on very little food, and another was about learning to distinguish between dreams and delusions. As she wrote, Whisper would position himself on each completed page, his weight holding it flat against the table surface, as if his approval was required before she could move on to the next verse. The fair preparations consumed the neighborhood with gentle efficiency. Ivy coordinated with the city for permits and electrical access. Tommy organized a group of retired men to help set up tables and chairs. Mrs. Patterson and her granddaughter made signs advertising local food vendors. Clarine enlisted the other women in the building to organize a bake sale to raise money for new playground equipment at the elementary school. The stage itself was simple, a platform maybe 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep, with a basic sound system and enough electrical outlets for instruments and microphones. It sat at one end of the small park between the elementary school and the library, surrounded by mature oak trees that would provide shade for the audience. On Friday evening, as vendors set up their booths and families began claiming spots on the grass with blankets and folding chairs, Dax Merrow appeared like a storm cloud on a clear day. He found Maribel testing the microphone and adjusting the amplifier settings, his expensive suit and confident smile out of place among the neighborhood families and local volunteers. "Still time to change your mind," he said, approaching the stage with the casual arrogance of someone used to getting what he wanted. "I've got a showcase tonight at the Ryman. Real industry people, record label executives. All you have to do is sign the contract and show up. This little community theater thing will still be here next year." The offer hung in the air between them like incense, sweet and intoxicating. The Ryman Auditorium was the mother church of country music, the place where careers were made and legends were born. How many Nashville dreamers would kill for the chance he was offering? But as she looked out at the families spreading blankets on the grass, at Tommy adjusting the height of a folding chair for an elderly neighbor, at Ivy threading extension cords between the trees, at Clarine sampling cookies from the bake sale table, Maribel realized that she had already made her choice. It hadn't been a dramatic moment of decision, but a gradual recognition of where she belonged. Whisper, who had been exploring the stage and greeting the setup volunteers, jumped onto the platform and made his way to the microphone stand. He wrapped himself around its base like a furry anchor, his green eyes focused on Dax with an intensity that seemed almost human in its judgment. "I think I'll stay here," Maribel said, her voice steady, despite the trembling in her chest. "This is where I belong." Dax's smile faltered for the first time since she had known him. "You're making a mistake. Community stages don't pay the rent. Local crowds don't launch careers. You'll be singing to the same 20 people for the rest of your life." "Maybe," Maribel said, scratching behind Whisper's ears as he purred against the microphone stand. "But they'll be my 20 people." Saturday dawned with clear skies. Families occupied picnic tables. Children ran around Whisper, who sat beside the amplifier like a small conductor. Maribel sang the songs born from the resurrected file, from antibiotic fever, from overdue bills, from the building's petition, from Clarine's hand, from disappearance and return, and always from Whisper. There was the scent of cut grass and fresh hope. People didn't leave when she finished the first song, or the second, or when her voice cracked a little on the third, and Whisper pressed his head against her ankle like someone holding on. In the end, there was no explosion of fame. There was something rarer, belonging. The veteran confirmed the monthly stage in the square. Ivy invited her for a musical reading at the library. Halva, swallowing hard, admitted the building seemed more alive. The morning of the fair arrived with the kind of clarity that seemed to promise good things. The sky was that particular shade of blue that only appeared in late spring, unmarked by clouds and bright enough to make everything below it seem more vivid. Maribel woke early, not from anxiety, but from excitement, a feeling she hadn't experienced in months. Whisper was already awake, sitting in the window watching the early activity in the park across the street. Vendors were arriving with trucks and trailers, unloading tables and tents, and the cheerful chaos of a community event coming to life. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted up from the cafe downstairs, mixing with the green scent of grass still damp with morning dew. She dressed carefully in a simple blue sundress that her mother had sent for Christmas, paired with the boots she had worn to every important audition and performance since arriving in Nashville. They were scuffed and comfortable, like old friends who had witnessed both her failures and small triumphs. As she braided her hair, Whisper jumped onto the bathroom counter to supervise, his green eyes bright with what seemed like anticipation. The walk to the park felt ceremonial. Clarine met them in the hallway carrying a covered dish that smelled like cinnamon and butter. "Monkey bread for after your performance," she said, linking her arm through Maribel's as they descended the stairs together. "My grandmother always said that celebrating comes after the work is done, but the sweetness should be waiting." The park was transforming before their eyes. What had been an empty green space yesterday was now dotted with colorful tents and booths. A bounce house inflated near the playground, while children watched in fascination. The bake sale table groaned under the weight of pies, cookies, and casseroles contributed by neighbors. Maribel was still learning to know by name. Tommy Rodriguez had positioned himself near the stage with a folding chair and a thermos of coffee, apparently planning to serve as unofficial master of ceremonies. "You ready for this?" he asked as Maribel began setting up her equipment. "Got quite a crowd gathering already." Indeed, families were arriving steadily, spreading blankets on the grass and claiming spots at the picnic tables. Children chased each other between the trees, while parents chatted and unpacked coolers. The atmosphere was relaxed, expectant, the kind of casual anticipation that came with community events where everyone knew everyone else. Ivy appeared with a clipboard and the efficient energy of someone who had organized many school events. "You're scheduled for 11:30, she told Maribel, "right after the elementary school choir and before the barbecue lunch. Perfect timing. People will be settled in and ready to listen." Whisper had positioned himself near the amplifier, greeting children and adults with equal dignity. His presence seemed to draw people to the stage area, parents pausing to let their children pet him while they examined the modest setup. A few neighbors asked Maribel about her music, expressing genuine interest in what she planned to perform. "I heard you singing the other night," said Mrs. Kim from the apartment building next door. "Beautiful voice. My daughter is studying music at Belmont. She'd love to hear you play." The elementary school choir was a group of about 20 third graders who took the stage with the serious concentration that children bring to important tasks. Their teacher, a young woman with infinite patience, guided them through a medley of folk songs that had the audience smiling and humming along. When they finished, applause rippled across the park, not the polite clapping of obligation, but the warm appreciation of a community celebrating its own. Then it was Maribel's turn. She stepped onto the small stage with her guitar, Whisper at her feet like a furry talisman. The crowd wasn't large, maybe 60 people scattered across the grass and at the picnic tables, but they were present in a way that felt different from bar audiences or audition panels. These were her neighbors, people who had searched for her lost cat and signed petitions on her behalf, who had lent her equipment and offered extra work when she needed it. "Good morning," she said into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly across the park. "I'm Maribel Ansley and I live just across the street. A few months ago I was ready to give up on music, ready to pack up my guitar and head home. But then I found this guy," she gestured toward Whisper, who had taken his position beside the amplifier. "Or maybe he found me. And through him I found all of you." She began with the song she had recovered from the folder Whisper had chosen to sleep on, the one about highways and hometowns, and the space between wanting and needing. Her voice was steady, clear, filled with the certainty that came from singing to people who were listening, not because they had to, but because they chose to. "There's a highway that runs through my hometown, but all the signs point away from here. There's a highway that runs through my heart now, but I'm not sure which direction leads me clear." The second song was newer, written during the weeks of Whisper's recovery from his respiratory infection, about healing and the cost of caring for something fragile. As she sang, she could see Clarine nodding along, Tommy tapping his fingers against his coffee cup, children leaning against their parents while Whisper supervised from his post near the speakers. Sometimes love costs more than you budgeted. Sometimes healing takes longer than planned. But the heart keeps accounts in its own currency, and the balance is held in your hands. The third song almost broke her. It was about loss and searching, and the terrible helplessness of love when its object disappears. Her voice cracked slightly on the chorus. I called your name until the echoes came back empty, walked every street until my shadow grew long, and that's when Whisper moved, pressing his head against her ankle in a gesture of support that was felt by everyone watching. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. This wasn't that kind of venue, but it was sustained and genuine. People weren't rushing to leave or checking their phones. They were present, connected to the music and to each other in the way that only happens when art emerges from community rather than being imposed upon it. After her set, as families began moving toward the food vendors and the afternoon activities, people approached the stage to talk, not about record deals or management contracts, but about the songs themselves, about how the lyrics had reminded them of their own stories, about how rare it was to hear music that felt personal rather than manufactured. Tommy Rodriguez shook her hand with the firm grip of someone who had spent his life evaluating talent. That's the real thing, he said. Not the Nashville machine version, but the real thing. We'd be honored to have you play here regularly, maybe once a month when the weather's good. Ivy was practically bouncing with excitement. The library does a music and stories series during the school year, local musicians paired with authors or poets. Would you be interested? It doesn't pay much, but it's a wonderful audience. Even Halver, the building manager who had been so strict about the no pets policy, approached with something that might have been an apology in his expression. Building seems different lately, he said, nodding toward Whisper, who was accepting attention from a group of children. More, I don't know, more like a community, I guess. Maybe we could organize a little concert in the courtyard sometime, for the residents. As the afternoon wore on and the fair continued around them, Maribel found herself part of conversations she had never imagined having. Not about making it big or getting discovered, but about the role of music in daily life, about how art could serve a community, about the difference between entertainment and connection. Months later, as autumn painted the leaves copper and gold, Maribel's apartment wall held new decorations, photos from the fair, the receipt for Whisper's microchip, the veterinary prescription, the first flyer with her name printed small but clear. She understood now that transformation hadn't meant trading one dream for another. It had meant discovering that a voice without people is just an echo. Whisper, calm, curious, loyal, hadn't saved anyone. He had stitched spaces together, brought hands closer, pushed open doors that were already ajar. She still sang at the cafe, still worked at the thrift store when she needed extra money, still felt a pang when she saw a big stage on TV. But when doubt crept in, so did Whisper, with his green eyes that held streetlight-like secrets, lying on blank pages until songs found their homes. In the last paragraph she wrote for herself and never showed anyone, there was a question. What if fame isn't a destination, but a distance? Whisper walked across the question, and with the delicacy of someone asking permission from the world, stayed still. Maribel smiled, closed the notebook, and tuned her guitar. Outside the city breathed. Inside hope had a sound, low, constant, that seemed like a whisper. And like every whisper, it left the feeling that there was still something to be discovered. The monthly concerts in the park became a neighborhood tradition, drawing not just residents but people from surrounding areas who heard about the informal gatherings through word of mouth. Maribel's songs evolved with the seasons, reflecting the rhythms of community life, celebrations and sorrows, arrivals and departures, the small dramas that made up the fabric of belonging. Whisper remained her constant companion and unofficial mascot, his presence at each performance as reliable as sunrise. Children would arrive early just to visit with him, and he seemed to understand his role as both comfort and catalyst, moving through the crowd with the grace of someone who knew exactly where he belonged. The fame Maribel had once dreamed of never came, but something better took its place. The recognition that comes from being truly seen by people who matter, the satisfaction of work that serves something larger than ambition, and the deep contentment of knowing that her voice had found its proper home, not in the bright lights of distant stages, but in the gentle illumination of community, where every song was a conversation and every performance was a gift exchanged between neighbors who had become family. And in the quiet moments, when the crowds had gone home and the equipment was packed away, Maribel would sit with Whisper on her fire escape, watching the city settle into its evening rhythms, understanding finally that the greatest success wasn't being heard by everyone, but being truly listened to by the people who chose to stay.